Fragility and anti-confidence. I am often frustrated by deep-seated and highly normalized and rewarded patterns of incompetence and weakness. Some refer to this societal dynamic commonly as crab mentality. This happens when members of a group attempt to reduce the self-confidence of any member who achieves success beyond others out of envy, jealousy, resentment, spite, conspiracy, or competitive feelings in order to halt their progress. They take actions to sabotage success, talent, or high performance. Of course, such actions cause mistrust, toxicity, and further sabotage, elevating colonial divide and conquer mechanisms operating on different fronts, hence further isolating individuals, preventing folk from learning, collaborating, and organizing against this. Systemic fragility and anti-confidence resulting from these societal dynamics stunt the growth of individuals and societies. It's devastatingly effective, especially when it is incentivized within fundamental societal units like families or organizations. The industries profiting from this dynamic include gaming, gambling, social media, and even local tourism. What makes this dynamic so difficult to address?
Yeah, everything you shared makes me think about the little power syndrome that is unfortunately so common, and how in these narcissistic cultures that we live, it's more common than you would like to find people that have massive gaps between their ego and their actual competence. So they manufacture importance through these arbitrary rules, hoarding information, creating bottlenecks where they are the gatekeeper, pushing anyone who bypasses them. And they make simple things complicated so they seem necessary. It's all fueled by this constant fear of irrelevance. So they kind of, as you said, jealously guard their small domain, react with hysteria to any threat, take credit for others' work, and sabotage anyone who might outshine them. I think this crab mentality you mentioned is spot on and helps explain how it operates collectively. So in a crab bucket, it's one crab pulling down another. It's a whole system where every crab who tries to escape gets pulled down by multiple crabs. And over time, this creates a kind of anti-selection process where the people who thrive are often those who don't stand out because they are at the bottom and they are quiet there, or those who learn to sabotage well enough. So I think this helps explain why this dynamic is so difficult to address, because it becomes kind of self-reinforcing at different levels. On the psychological level, through this ego defense, through institutions, through the incentives and selection, and through culture, through these narratives that rationalize this sabotage. So there is this weaponization of insecurity, where people with a big status need and a small competence base can't earn respect through contribution, so they secure it through obstruction. Institutionally, there is this reward system that rewards the wrong things. So it's kind of almost like if the system selected for safe mediocrity because it's easier to control, and competence is actually threatening to fragile power. And I think there's also this cultural element where this environment of scarcity turn people into competitors, and then competition becomes normalized. And there's also this network effect where gatekeepers form mutual protection networks, where challenging one node triggers the defense of the whole thing. And meanwhile, competent people are often isolated. So I think there is a pattern there on mediocre people rising because controllable incompetence is often less disruptive. And once in place, they can create value. So they manufacture this relevance by controlling access. The crab bucket starts producing fear, distrust, lateral aggression that prevents collaboration. It's exactly the conditions that protect colonial divide and conquer dynamics and block collective organizing. So it's hard to address, I think, because it's an identity defense backed by a promotion system and enforced by a kind of group narrative.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I think you described it really well on a individual and societal level. And I think when you talk about institutions and organizations and their role in implementing this incentivization structure, I think we're talking about that overlap between capitalism and colonization, about how specific cultures are implemented over generations in a particular society as part of an ethnocidal regime to essentially control the behaviors of people by embedding them with this narrative of insecurity and hence vulnerable narcissism. Because at the end of the day, it fits the profit structures that the colonizers are implementing in that place so as to guarantee essentially their control, which is a fragile control because they are the minority number in that settler colony, especially. Whereas the indigenous people, if not broken enough, essentially, if not ethnocided enough or genocided enough, are always going to rebel, always going to rise up and take control again. So I think there's this insecurity that ultimately comes from fear of losing power, where they have illegally or violently taken power. And we see this all the time in the ruthless corporate world of essentially the one who is not necessarily the smartest or the most talented, but basically the one who is the most ruthless or the one with the greatest political connections, who can leverage political threat, who gets the biggest profits, essentially, whose organization dominates industries, essentially. We see this a lot across the global south, but it doesn't happen only in the global south. It happens in the global north. And that was the system that was created in order to colonize. Because this element of greed, essentially, once you have that profit structure that is based upon domination, control, violence, oppression, extraction, etc., then you have this cyclical sort of like consume and use that power to consume more. And so this dynamic, I think, is simply part of that system, this dynamic of crab mentality. I don't necessarily see it as the choice of the individual to perpetuate crab mentality, although in many cases, like that is the case, like you're an adult and you have the choice to not do that, but you do choose to do that, especially, for example, when it's something as, benign as like somebody who looks better than you. And then just because of that, you choose to sabotage them or spread, gossip or lies or whatever about them, etc. But I do see this as like a broader effect of ethnocide as a way of colonized culture and colonized mindset rooting in the racism narrative, right? Of you are never good enough and you can never be aspiring to the upper classes because you have your place somewhere in the class system and you are supposed to make money essentially for the rich people because they are smarter or prettier or, you know, more socially valuable somehow. Or even worse, more spiritual or more somehow a higher sort of being in comparison to somebody who grew up in less fortunate circumstances. That's part of the, I think, way that the class system itself regulates itself, how it maintains itself. So in some ways, there is also this element, I don't know, I mean, this is not something that I've researched specifically, but I have a gut feeling that this dynamic of perpetuating the class system comes from a civilizational dynamic, meaning that in order to perpetuate civilization, class system needs to exist in order for such a thing as the upper classes to exist to control the lower classes by giving excuses essentially or reasons or in some cases fair exchange of like protection, protecting the city, protecting the civilization, protecting our way of life, protecting our identity as a culture, etc., even though that is entirely made up and unnatural in a way. So I see this crab mentality dynamic as being part of much kind of older and wider systems of societal manipulation through individual emotional manipulation, but also these incentivization structures within society, within organizations, within economic systems, and the political system overarching that is simply in service to all of those things.
I totally agree with you around this being much more complex than just an individual choice, even though sometimes that is the case. This is something that is conditioning us from a long time and kind of creating assumptions that we don't question about. I think in organizational context, this would be referred to as cultures of professionalism, what we consider to be a professional, the sacrifices we need to make, the rationalizations, the trade-offs, etc., the competition. But there's also, in a larger societal level, there is also this dynamic of we need to prove our worth at every opportunity. You need this kind of constant toxic validation from others, and you need to be better than others. And it's almost like there is a threat all the time underneath that kind of triggers, because in the crab, it's like, is that kind of survival thing that triggers chaos and like that survival mode. And I think it's in our societal case is not a sudden, very intense threat. It's a mild threat that is always there. And with time, you start to normalize that threat. And it's kind of, you enter in this automatic mode of acting in certain ways that you don't realize why, like you are acting in that way, or you disconnect from your own more nuanced understanding of yourself, like what fears is triggering me, like why am I acting this way, or what do I really want? Is this what I'm seeking, what I really want, or is that just kind of fulfilling my need in a twisted and toxic way? So I think that it's much more complex psychologically, and the manipulation and the control that you were talking about is so perfected that we don't notice, right? Like the threat is always there, but it's silent almost.
Yeah, and I think you've described how it works on the intergenerational level, because especially when you've had like, let's say, a whole career in a certain industry being validated in that kind of way, where you are trained to essentially receive gratification for certain types of behaviors, or especially competitive behaviors that are putting down other people in order to, get one up on them. I think this bleeds, right, in across generations into families, into society, into even things like religion, education, how you teach your children, etc. So it really only takes a couple generations for that to become baked in. And so for me, that is absolutely the mechanism of ethnocide through systems of capitalism or otherwise, any form of economic profit, simply because, yeah, how colonization has destroyed our other modes of economic life.
And I think this intergenerational aspect that you were mentioning is what slowly causes the common phrase, this is just how things are, right? Like there is a kind of sunk cost fallacy embedded in an intergenerational level of investment in that thing, and then a sort of weird attachment to how things are, even though that is not healthy and
Like
there
the
are
root of
better
all
options.
problems. Yeah, there are
Yeah.
absolutely better options. Yeah, absolutely.